Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Amoral Philosopher YouTube blog. We're still continuing to talk about philosophy of religion with my friend Dima Zhyvov. Hello, Dima.
Hello.
Good to have you on here. And today we're going to talk about the Kalam cosmological arguments for existence of God. So our today's episode is going to be a little different from the ones we did before. There's not going to be a lot of discussion of the back and forth between Dima and myself. Rather, today Dima will take the floor to give a short lecture or presentation on the argument. So at this time, we'll not be going that much into the critique of the argument, but we'll try to do is to clarify the argument to make sure that we understand it fully. And then in the next episode, we'll think about some of the objections to the arguments. And so the next episode will be more like our usual format. But that said, I think we have a lot of material to cover. And as Dima goes along, I'll try not to interrupt him that much. But if there are some clarifications or comments on the way, I may jump in as well. And we may have a little discussion going on. That said, I think I'm going to hand it over to Dima to present the Kalam cosmological argument for us.
Thank you, Anton. It's a real treat. So so today we're going to be talking about the Kalam cosmological argument. So let me give a very brief history of the term. Kalam is an Arabic word that means speech. In Islamic medieval theology, it also designated a practice or science of adducing proofs for the existence of God. Or more generally, it designated a rational statement of belief. And in recognition of the valuable contribution that Islamic scholars made to the argument, Dr. William Lane Craig, who is the most famous proponent of the argument today, dubbed the argument the Kalam cosmological argument. So like any cosmological argument, right? So let's just remind our audience what is a cosmological argument. It's an argument that takes some feature or fact about the universe, cosmos, that cries out for an explanation and attempts to argue that it's best explained or caused by the activity of the first cause, which first cause is God. In the case of the Kalam, the relevant fact is that the universe began to exist. So let's now move to the statement of the argument. Right, and before I say anything, I just want to acknowledge that I took this formulation of the argument from Dr. Timothy McGrew, whose presentation on the art of reasoning and rules of inference I have recently watched, and I really found this to be a helpful way of stating the argument. And I think this is to be preferred for anyone who wants to defend the Kalam cosmological argument, as I will later explain why this formulation and not some other. But basically it reads like this. Premise one, if the physical universe began to exist, then it was caused to exist by something else. Premise two, the physical universe began to exist. Therefore, conclusion, the physical universe was caused to exist by something else. So you might remember that in our previous episodes, we talked about what makes for a good argument and what makes for a good deductive argument. And one of the criteria of that is that a good argument will not have any equivocation, will not have any shifts in meaning in the terms that are used throughout the argument. So the first task for us is to seek to define our terms that we're going to be using. So let's start with the term physical universe. So by physical universe, one means here all physical reality, including all matter, energy, time, and space. And especially I want to emphasize the last two because it's often misunderstood. When, say, cosmologists or astrophysicists talk about an absolute beginning of the universe and the Big Bang, they do not mean the explosion of super dense pellet of matter into pre-existing space. Right? Rather, they mean that space itself had a beginning and is expanding. So, as an illustration, and I find this one especially helpful, think of a balloon that has buttons glued on its surface, and um, the buttons are stuck to the surface of the balloon, right? And they don't move across the surface of the balloon. But as you blow up the balloon, right, as the buttons recede from each other, right, the buttons will grow farther and farther apart. So the relevant illustration here is that the two-dimensional surface of the balloon serves to illustrate our three-dimensional space that is expanding, right? And the buttons represent the galaxies that are, just like the buttons that are stuck on the surface of the balloon, are actually at rest in space. It's just that as space itself is expanding, so do the galaxies draw further and further apart from each other. And I just thought this would be a helpful illustration for us. But there are limitations to any illustration of the expansion of the universe, right? And I want to point to two aspects of this illustration that might be misleading. So when you think about the balloon with buttons glued to its surface and so on, there is some meaning to the idea of the balloon having a center. Right? The balloon having a center, it's kind of inside of the balloon, there is a center of it. But physically speaking, it's meaningless to talk about the center of the universe, right? If you think of each button as a galaxy, for any observer on any button or in any galaxy, there would be an impression of them being in the center of the universe as they look out and see the galaxies withdrawing or receding more and more from them. There will be an appearance of that galaxy being the center. But that's not really a fact about the objective fact of the matter. Rather, it's a perspectival fact, right? It's relative to the observer looking out into other galaxies. So it's a bit misleading there, but it's also a bit misleading in that there is nothing in the balloon illustration that corresponds. So balloon is expanding in space, into space, but there is nothing really that corresponds to the case of the space itself expanding. Physically speaking, it's meaningless to say, to ask, well, into what space does space itself expand, right? So, and that's where it becomes mind-boggling to think about it or try to envisage, try to sort of imagine it because of how difficult it is. We think and imagine already in spatial way, and so it's hard to completely avoid it in our imagination. Yes, so that's what I would want to say about physical universe term. So let's now go to the next key term. Yeah,
so, Dima, sorry, before we go ahead, so just to clarify, so when we speak about the physical universe beginning to exist in this argument, what's meant is not the matter beginning to exist, but more of the space itself coming into existence. Is that the thing? Is that the claim?
Oh, it means, thank you. Yeah, the claim is that all matter, energy, and space and time, because space and time you could think of as an arena in which matter interacts and in which events involving matter take place. So by saying that space and time itself began to exist, you are necessarily including the matter right. that is in that arena, right? As the arena itself had a beginning, so is anything in it. So it would be included in the concept of physical universe.
But it's important to keep in mind that the space and time are included in the physical universe, and sometimes people tend to think about the the matter and they forget about the space and time themselves, right?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Good.
That's right. That's right. Good. So the next key term is began to exist, right? And I want to say from the get-go, Craig's version of the Kalam cosmological argument is from start to finish predicated upon a particular theory of time called a tense theory of time, or alternatively an A theory of time, according to which temporal becoming is an objective feature of reality. So what do I mean by that? According to so it's kind of a common sense view that things really do come into existence and go out of existence. They do come to be and cease existing. That's not just a feature of our consciousness or our perspective on reality that is kind of an illusion. Rather, this is a fact about the world as such, that temporal becoming really truly characterizes it. And according to this view, not all moments of time are equally real. So the past, present, and future moments are not equally real. The present occupies a kind of a special ontological category and or has a special ontological status. It alone is existent or real. And this view of time is quite controversial. So one of the biggest challenges to Craig's version of the Kalam is to argue that this more controversial theory of time is true. So next in our next episode, we will have to go into this because I think it's fascinating, and it's but also a lot hangs on this for the Kalam. And so later on, even in my presentation, I'll talk about different theories of time. But for now, let's just leave it at the kind of this notion of beginning to exist. Let's leave it at the common sense kind of pre-theoretic level, but then I promise that I will define it more precisely. So that's to come in just a bit. And then finally, let's talk about caused, right? The term caused. And here, really, a defender of the Kalam need not be wedded to some particular analysis or definition of causation. So he or she has options here. Cause as a concept could be treated as a theoretical primitive, right? Something that cannot be more helpfully defined in terms of previously defined concepts, right? That cause, just like some other notions that are primitive, they're like, we could think of them as like building blocks of any theorizing, that you can't, in a kind of circular way, keep on defining it and reducing it into something more basic. That we are here dealing with something that itself is that basic. So maybe an illustration from another field of philosophy than metaphysics would be an illustration from ethics. So there are a number of ethicists that think that the concept of a reason, what it means for something to be a reason, is a primitive concept. So if the theorist who thinks that is forced to define it in some way, they could respond, well, a reason is a consideration in favor of something, right? Whether that something be some action, for example, we can have reasons for action, considerations in favor of doing some particular action, or this something in view is, adopting some propositional attitude like belief, hope, desire, wish. So we could have reasons to hope, reasons that something is the case, reasons to believe that something is the case, reasons to want some state of affairs to obtain, and so on. So you have these, regardless of what that something is, there is this relation of standing in favor of. But the trouble with this way of defining or analyzing what it means for something to be a reason is that very quickly, when you begin asking questions about that relation and trying to make sense of that relation itself, you fall back on some concept of reason at this point. So you can't get out of the need for some notion of reason when you are trying to unpack the in favor of relation. And so that would be, I think, just an example of a primitive concept. So that's one possibility for a proponent of the Kalam, is just to say, look, you could treat it as a primitive and that's fine, the argument will go through as long as you're consistently applying the term caused. But another possibility is adopting some preferred analysis of causation. And again, the proponent of the Kalam could be pretty open-handed as to which one the person suggests, right? So as long as two conditions are observed. So the first condition is that we follow David Hume and we treat causes and effects as separate existences. They're not the same thing. They're not just a description of the same thing, but we should treat them as distinct. And secondly, that no highly controversial notions, right, are just defined or made part of the very definition of what it means to be a cause for something, right? So for example, one such controversial idea would be that simultaneous causation is incoherent, that causes and events cannot simultaneously exist, that causes must of necessity precede their effects in time, right? Temporal preceding of causes in relation to events. The reason why, what I want to say at this point is that such ideas as that simultaneous causation is incoherent, it should be shown via an argument. It shouldn't be assumed from the start, and it shouldn't be made just part of your definition. That would be question begging, right? We should settle that by an argument and not just assume from the beginning. You could still further talk about the inductive case for causes preceding their effects and so on. That's fine, as long as you don't make it the very definition of what it means to be a cause. And so make any argument about that just sort of redundant, because that's just how we define things, period. Right. So that's what I wanted to say about this. Anton, if you have any thoughts on this point before I continue?
Oh, I think it's clear at this point. We can move on. Great. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So having, remember here we're dealing with a deductive argument. And if you recall, we talked about sort of the checklist that we have to go through. One is that the argument does not have any equivocation in the use of the terms throughout the argument. But the moment we establish that there is no equivocation, the terms are used in the same way throughout the argument, then in the case of a deductive argument, we want to ask, well, what is the logical form of this deductive argument before us, and whether the argument is valid, right? And which rule of inference has been observed in deducing the conclusion that it presents to us, right? So in our case, let P be the proposition or statement or sentence, whatever you prefer. The physical universe began to exist. Let Q be the proposition that the physical universe was caused to exist by something else. And if then we can observe that we're dealing here with a case of modus ponens, right? When we talked about it previously, that would essentially say if P then Q, P, therefore conclusion Q. So, and I think everyone can acknowledge that the argument is valid. So the key question, of course, will be for us to investigate whether. But as far as the logic is concerned, I think everyone can sort of agree that it's valid. Now, I do want to say something about different formulations that the argument has had over the years, and even its most famous proponent, Dr. William Lane Craig, has used different arguments over time. And the argument that I suggest is the best is there on the left hand side, right, in the column to the left. And then in the column to the right is maybe a formulation that has been more popular, but which Craig in recent years has kind of abandoned for something like what we see on the left, in the left box, right? So we're familiar with what's on the left, so let's just read what's on the right. P1 in that formulation reads, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe begins to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, right? And so we want to also ask, okay, so we know that the left-hand side argument is modus ponens, right? But what about the right-hand side, and why indeed? there is any serious difference, and why would anyone prefer the left over the right formulation? So let's briefly spend some time. So I immediately apologize for the technicality of it, but I do want the logical structure of the right-sided formulation to be clear to all. So in order to show the logic of the formulation of the first premise, which says everything that begins to exist has a cause, we need to use the language of predicate calculus. Okay, so let me just explain the symbols that you see. The rotated A is a universal quantifier that is commonly used in predicate calculus, right? X stands for a variable, right, that ranges over some domain. And the rotated A with respect to X, right, basically says in English, right, it says for all X, or alternatively, take any X you like, such and such, or for all X, such and such, or every X, for every X, such and such. But we will just stick to for all X for simplicity's sake. Now, there is a scope to this quantifier. It quantifies over the sentence, if Px, then Qx, right? So let me just define what is meant by Px and Qx. Px can be translated as X begins to exist. So here you're predicating onto the variable a particular property, namely beginning to exist. Similarly for Qx, you're predicating a particular property to the variable X, namely that it has a cause. And so the entire construction therefore reads, for all X, if X begins to exist, then X has a cause, right? And then premise 2 is PU. It says of the universe specifically as one object in the domain of all objects over which the variable ranges. It says, well, the universe begins to exist. It asserts that a predicate is true of the universe, right? And it is this move that then together with P1 allows one to deduce, according to the rules of predicate calculus, the conclusion that QU, the universe, has a cause, right? So you could see the similarity between modus ponens, right, and the statement of universal quantification. But the reason why I even brought the two is for you to see why it might matter which formulation you choose. So let's think about that. How could you go about disproving or refuting a statement for all X, if X begins to exist, then X has a cause? Because it's making a universal claim. Then finding even one instance of a violation of this principle, one proven counterexample, is sufficient for refuting P1 in the formulation on the right, right? So, for example, if we observe that certain things just emerge in quantum vacuum, right? Certain fundamental particles just appear in quantum vacuum, and suppose we say that they're uncaused and so on, then so that would be, in principle, a strategy that you could use to refute P1, right? In the formulation on the right, and therefore show the argument to be unsound, case closed. But that may not necessarily or automatically mean, right, that P1 in the formulation on the left is thereby shown to be false, right? Because there the claim is about physical universe specifically, that if it began to exist, then it was caused to exist by something else. So that's an example where the formulation to the left makes a more modest claim in the first premise, still gets you to the desired conclusion, namely that it was caused to exist by something else, or that the universe has a cause. But it gets you there by a more modest first step, which is not as open to refutation or strategies for refutation as the P1 in the column on the right is open to. Right. So that's an example. Yeah, Anton,
Yeah,
Any
so Dima, at
comments?
this point, yeah, I just wanted to clarify. So what would be, so we see what the disadvantage of the formulation on the right is, but what is the
Mm-hmm.
advantage that it gives to us? Why would someone want to formulate their arguments in this second way that we see on the right-hand side?
Oh, why would somebody want to stick to the right-hand sided
Yes,
formulation?
yes, right.
Well, in a way, you kind of you immediately, clearly appeal to the intuition, right?
Right.
That things can just come into existence uncaused. You kind of
Mhm.
immediately wear it on your sleeve.
Yeah,
Whereas on the left-hand side, you're making claim about a particular thing, the universe, that if it began to exist, then it has a cause, and then your
yeah.
supporting evidence might include those metaphysical intuitions.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
P1 on the right-hand side sort of immediately gets there, but by
Hmm.
so doing, it already is using the supporting consideration in favor of something like P1 on the left-hand side as its premise.
Yeah, yeah,
And in a way, you don't have to do that. You can steelman the argument by making more modest claim, which still is sufficient to arrive at the conclusion that the right-hand sided argument arrives at.
yeah, yeah.
The universe has a cause. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so in other words, someone would want to make the argument in the second way, the one we see on the right, because it's more intuitively appealing, because it compares the universe to all the other things that we compare that we're familiar with. And it says that, well, look, the universe is just one of these things, and most of the things that we can think of have come into existence, have begun to exist at some point. So there's no reason for
Mm-hmm.
us to single out the universe. Whereas the claim on the left-hand side is more modest in a way, but it lacks this
Mm-hmm.
appeal to the intuition because someone can question and try to single out the universe and say, well, maybe the universe enjoys a special status. So
Yeah.
it avoids this comparison to other things. So it's modest on the one side, and on the other hand, it's lacking this appeal to our
Yeah.
intuitions, and it may make us question whether the universe is just
Yeah.
one of those things,
Yeah.
right?
And so we will, exactly. So we will come to talk about the supporting evidence for P1 on the left-hand side. And in fact, it will be very similar to the supporting evidence or explication of P1, right? What it means metaphysically speaking on the right-hand side. It's just that there is advantages for stating a premise in such a way that if only one supporting argument in its favor is knocked down, the whole premise is not thereby been shown to be refuted. Whereas by already adopting one of the supports for the premise, as we will come to see what the supporting evidence for P1 on the left-hand sided formulation is, but by already sticking and putting all your eggs into a particular universal claim with respect to everything for all x, right? Then you are more vulnerable to counterexamples, right? Because the only way you could actually refute P1 in particular on the left-hand side is by showing that it's possible that the physical universe began to exist, but it's not the case that it was caused to exist by something else. You see, in other words, the charge there, the refutation or the counterexample would have to just be about the physical universe itself, not just something else. Whereas on the right-hand side of the formulation, it could just be anything, any
Right,
X would
right.
do to refute it, because we've just given an instance that falsifies the quantification statement,
Yeah,
which is universal
yeah,
quantification statement.
yeah.
Case closed. So
Hmm.
that's the danger there.
Yeah. But on the
Right?
other hand,
But
it's
yeah,
yeah, but on the other hand, there's probably not that many things that we can think of that, haven't wasn't
yeah,
have come into existence without being caused by something else. So it's not like that we can
yeah,
immediately think of a counterexample, but it opens the possibility for a
exactly.
greater number of these counterexamples, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and its immediate relevance to premise one, which
Mm,
would have to be established for the left hand side formulation. Right.
cool.
Exactly right. So let's, for the sake of time, continue. Yeah.
Yep, let's move on.
All right. Right. So let me just make it clear what the structure of supporting evidence is for premise one. So let's read the premise again. If the physical universe began to exist, then it was caused to exist by something else. Right. So let's just, for now, appreciate what this premise states, right? So it's a conditional, and like I already mentioned, the only way to falsify a conditional statement is to show that the antecedent clause is true, but the consequent is false, right? That's the only logically possible way to refute a conditional statement. Under all other truth value assignments, you do not have a refutation of the first premise. And even if somebody were to say at this point, but the universe never began to exist, that would be an objection to premise 2, to which we will come. It would not be sufficient to refute the conditional premise that if it began to exist, then it was caused to exist by something else. As far as strictly logical terrain here, so let's think of what could be a way that what are the possible strategies to say the antecedent is true, but the consequent is false? There appears to be 2 possibilities. Again, strictly logically, 2 possibilities. One is that it was caused all right, but it was caused to exist not by something else. But that would be equivalent of saying it was self-caused, right? So there are 2 mutually exclusive categories: caused to exist by something else, caused to exist by itself. And the notion of self-causation, most people think is problematic, it's incoherent, and therefore impossible. So what would it even mean to say that the universe created itself? It would have to already exist in order to do the creating of itself. And there is a problem, right? So it exists before it exists, right? In order to create its own, like to bring itself into being. And so most people think that the notion of self-causation in this sense is metaphysically impossible because of its incoherence. So therefore, the real option here of affirming the antecedent but negating the consequent would be to say that the universe began to exist, all right, but it began to exist uncaused. It was not caused, period, by anything. Which is why the main line of argumentation has revolved around this issue of, does it follow from the fact that it began to exist that there was some cause or not? And again, the relevant category is caused by something else, because we've already excluded self-causation as relevant here. And so when you look at this graph, P1 obviously stands for premise 1, and then the arrows, 3 arrows represent 3 different lines of reasoning, 3 different arguments that Dr. William Lane Craig advanced in support of this premise, right? And I want to again reiterate that both premises, premise 1 and 2, as far as their supporting evidence, are predicated on the theory of time that we will discuss in a second. So just stick to that common sense idea that beginning to exist has something to do with coming into being, absolute becoming, and not right. And so let's look at the first line first. So the first line of evidence or argumentation is that the conditional premise is rooted in one of first principles of metaphysics, which in Latin is stated ex nihilo nihilo fit. Like we can translate that into English as out of nothing, nothing comes. So here the idea is that something cannot come into being out of nothing, right? And to come into existence without any cause whatsoever would be a case of coming into being out of nothing, right? Because there is no cause whatsoever that was at play there, right? And so the negating premise 1, right, would essentially be equivalent to saying that this first principle of metaphysics is violated, that something, namely the universe, did come into being out of nothing, right? In completely uncaused manner, uncaused from nothing. And so the charge against that way of refuting premise 1 is that it seems like we quit doing serious metaphysics if we say something like that. If we accept the idea that something can come into being uncaused out of nothing, then it seems like almost anything can go after that. Like it seems intuitively, so it's an appeal to intuition. It seems intuitively like what reason would have us think is that there has to be a cause of some
Right.
sort.
So
Right, so that's the first line. Yeah, go ahead, please.
so just to clarify at this point, so this first principle of metaphysics, is it just based on intuition, or is it based on maybe some empirical evidence that we have of other things in the universe?
Yeah.
So we never see nothing, something coming out of nothing, so we assume that it's not possible.
Yeah. So we will come to empirical support. As you could see, line 3 there has this point, right, about empirical evidence. But no, this is a priori. This is sort of us reflecting in the same way in which we could reflect. Nothing can be, let's say, green all over and blue all over, right? Similarly, the metaphysician here would say, out of nothing, nothing comes, right? It would be the same kind of incongruence with our reason to suppose otherwise. And notice that when we entertain the idea that something can be green all over and at the same time blue all over, right? In the same sense of all over, you don't need to go out into the world and investigate it. Just by thinking, you could see that that has to be the case, right? And so here, that's the claim, at least, that we have certain intuitions of pure reason. And one of such intuitions would be that out of nothing, nothing comes. That it's not just that we don't see it around us as happening, which is also relevant, as we'll come to see, but it's that reason itself revolts against the negation of that.
Right. So perhaps it's also the claim, it can be said that the claim is based on the inconceivability of something coming out of nothing. So we intuitively accept that this claim is true because we don't have to actually go and investigate, but when we try to imagine it to ourselves, when we try to conceive of something coming out of nothing, we just can't do it. And from that, we infer the impossibility of that happening.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So I agree with you that conceivability plays a role here, clearly, that we can't conceive of it as happening, right? Although, and I was going to bring it up later, David Hume, he responded to this argument by claiming that he could conceive of something coming into being, just popping into existence uncaused out of nothing. Like he could imagine a horse just appearing in his living room. So I will respond to that in our next episode as an objection. But the proponent of the Kalam here would say that yes, as we reflect on that possibility, we have a deep-seated intuition, rational intuition, that that's metaphysically impossible, that there's something wrong with the idea. And in a way, yes, this line of reasoning kind of appeals directly to our intuition here. The other two do not, but this one does. It appeals directly to the intuition. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Good. So go ahead.
No, cool. Let's move on.
Okay, good. So the second line of reasoning is that basically the thought is this. So suppose the first principle of metaphysics, ex nihilo nihilo fit, is violated when it comes to the universe, right? Then it becomes incomprehensible why not anything or everything comes into being uncaused, out of nothing, right? So you could kind of put it rhetorically or provocatively like this, like what could possibly constrain nothingness, that it favors universes, right? Like why is it that I don't know, Eskimo villages don't just pop into existence uncaused, out of nothing, that $1 billion doesn't just appear in front of me right now? And if you want to say, look, there's something that might constrain what's possible in the embedded context in which we live, like we live in space-time universe, right? And so maybe there is some kind of constraint. But if it's nothingness we're dealing with, and by nothingness here, I mean something very specific, as opposed to what some physicists, unfortunately, have made of it, which is just metaphorical sense of nothingness, where it really is something, like a quantum vacuum or what have you. But here, I mean, in a metaphysical sense of nothingness, which is the negation of anything whatsoever. And as such, there is no properties that's possessed by anything here. to be constrained by anything, to discriminate universes over other things. And so in that sense, it still remains inexplicable why only universes come into being out of nothing. So that's kind of the second line of reasoning, which goes from like, basically it's argumentum ad absurdum, right? Like, suppose it's not true, well, why then don't we see such and such? Or why only universes, and how can we make sense of that if we're dealing with a universal negation,
right,
and not something with properties? Yeah.
So at this point,
and then
maybe,
the final, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, maybe just a quick comment. We'll probably discuss this next time in the next episode, but I guess someone could come up with an explanation based on some kind of an Occam razor principle, saying that, look, we'll have to make an exception for the universe because universe is this basic thing, and of course we don't postulate something coming out of nothing beyond necessity, but this one time we have to make an exception so that we have some coherent worlds coming into place, because we have to do it at some point.
Yeah, exactly. And again, the question I guess here would be, what is the cost theoretically for somebody to make this move? Is the person guilty of something called taxi cab fallacy? I think it's Schopenhauer, and I know that Alexander Proust used that expression of a taxi cab fallacy. It's like you have used the taxi for everything. You know, you've arrived at your destination. Now you want to dismiss the taxi as irrelevant, just to save yourself from accepting a premise that leads to a conclusion that has certain implications for your worldview. That it just seems ad hoc a bit at this point. Unless you have some independent motivation for thinking that in fact is the case with the universe. Now, there has been this line of reasoning with respect to this, is that they want to say, look, you, the theist, are committing a composition fallacy. You go from what's true with respect to every part of the universe to what's true for the universe as a whole, and you can't do that, right? So that's the charge that's sometimes laid. But as we will come to see in just a bit, I don't think that that is a kind of fair charge. I don't think there's any composition fallacy going on here. But again, that's where the debate is. Is there such a fallacy? In other words, is it taxi cab fallacy on the one hand, or composition fallacy? And I think that it's not composition fallacy. If anything, it's taxi cab fallacy. If somebody wants to stick to their guns at this point and just make an exception for the universe, having arrived at any other instance to the truth of this metaphysical principle, right?
And
so the last line. Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, no, and I guess we'll discuss it again in the next episode, perhaps later on, as the atheist would typically accuse the theist of committing the same fallacy, because they introduced God into the picture, but then they have to make an exception of God and say it was not caused by anything. But I guess this is super important. Maybe now I can clarify. This is super important. Let's even look at the conditional premise in the right-hand sided formulation. So what is the claim? Everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. The claim is not everything whatsoever has a cause of its existence. Right. The claim is very specific. Anything that begins to exist must have a cause of its existence. In the case of God, no theist has ever claimed that he began to exist. That's just not part of classical theism. And that was never claimed, not because there was this argument that goes, like, this was just part of the dogma always, that we're dealing with a necessary being who never had a beginning. So therefore, and think of it this way, Bertrand Russell responded to Frederick Copleston in their debate in the 20th century, on radio debate, it's quite famous. He responded like this: when Copleston began pressing him for a need for a cause, Bertrand Russell said, well, the universe is just that, period. It's a brute fact. What Russell was doing there, he was basically saying, look, the universe does not require an explanation or cause because it has always existed. Right.
The trouble is that now we have some reasons to think that it didn't always exist. And therefore it comes under this principle of, if something begins to exist, we need some cause or explanation of that fact. So I do want early to make there's no special pleading for God. If something never begins to exist, I could totally see why somebody would say it doesn't need a cause. It has always been there.
Right. So in other words, for an atheist to claim that the claims about the universe and God are on par, atheists would have to deny the first premise saying that universe came into existence and say that universe was always there, just as the theist claims that God was
Yeah,
always there.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
But then notice that would be for the atheist to reject the second premise, not the first. The first states if it began to exist, then it was caused. The
right,
second
right,
states that it began to exist. So it would just be basically to accept the first premise, but just to reject the second. And
right.
we'll
This
come to the supporting evidence for that in just a second. Yeah.
Mm.
So then finally, there's the third line, third arrow, that is what you mentioned, empirical support. The principle is always confirmed and never disconfirmed in science and in our common experience. So what does it say? Basically, it's that we have excellent inductive reason to think that the metaphysical principle, and that's what we're dealing with here. Sometimes the detractor of the argument would want to say that what Craig or others defending it mean by nothing, out of nothing, nothing comes. It's some kind of physical principle, right? They don't. It's a metaphysical principle, which nevertheless has implications for what we should observe, right? In other words, no metaphysical principle, if it's universal, is compatible with a disconfirmation in experience, right? If there is physical reality that is incompatible with your metaphysical picture of reality, too bad for your metaphysics, right? In other words, you can, because metaphysics is more fundamental. And the principle, the universal principle on the metaphysical level will necessarily have to be in line, in harmony with physical laws and so on, right? So, but the fact remains, or so the claim goes, that the empirically, the metaphysical principle has never been disconfirmed, right? So here again, maybe one strategy for the detractor would be to say, well, in quantum mechanics, we observe a violation of that principle. So maybe next time we can talk about that as one line of attack here. But at the same time, just think of our common experience or how science proceeds. You come upon some effect. You don't think twice that the principle holds, right? You don't think twice with respect to the need for an explanation or causation. Like you come across a dead body in your living room or your kitchen. You don't like go, well, maybe it just appeared, popped into existence with a knife sticking in its back. And so it was uncaused. Like we immediately want to look for explanations and causes. So that's the idea here, that we have an overwhelming empirical inductive reason to kind of to expect causes when we see certain things coming into being or certain effects. Yeah. Is that good, Anton? Shall we continue? Or again,
Yeah.
next time we're going to talk about each of these and ask, are they cogent? And we can raise whatever objection.
Yeah. I guess
want.
next time
Yeah.
we can talk about some evidence from physics about atoms coming in and out of existence and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah,
but yeah,
exactly.
We'll next episode. So
That's
let's
great.
move on.
Okay, let's continue. Yeah. Right, so let's look at the structure of supporting evidence for premise 2. And I see that time is running out. So maybe, Anton, you'll decide to just stop the recording at a particular point and we could carry on next time. We'll see. But let me try to be as brief as possible. So we have two domains from which we can get our supporting arrows or supporting evidences or lines of reasoning. The science on the one hand and philosophy on the other. So let me immediately say, look, a huge disclaimer. I will now speak about the scientific confirmation, right, of the truth of premise 2, that the universe, the physical universe began to exist. But let me state it very clearly. I am a layman. I am not a physicist. I am interested in the area. I eagerly watch documentaries, read science books, but I do recognize that I cannot deal with sort of the actual detailed arguments, right? And so I'm going to be relying on experts here and just pointing people to relevant literature, perhaps. Right. So, but nevertheless, let me just state what I take to be the empirical confirmation of it, right? And so first there's evidence from astrophysics. And basically here the thought is that we have observational evidence that the universe is expanding. And as we trace the expansion of the universe back in time, we could see that the sort of the distance between any 2 points becomes closer and closer, closer and closer, until you reach a point at which the distance between any 2 points is effectively zero, right? And that would be the boundary of space and time. So it's based upon what we observe, and we extrapolate backwards from that, and then reason to the kind of the beginning of space-time, right? So in the description, we will link a video where famous cosmologist Alexander Vilenkin sort of discusses various models of the early universe which try to avoid this absolute beginning of space and time. And there have been, over the last 70 plus years of cosmology's existence, many attempts to avoid or avert the beginning of the universe. Some, I don't know, 13.7 or 8 billion years ago, which is what scientists estimate today, that it had a beginning. And so those models he discusses there, and he concludes that most of them actually assume, when you kind of think them through, they assume an absolute beginning of space and time. And some of them are problematic for other reasons, on other grounds. So he concludes that it's probable that the universe began to exist. Now, again, I'm not an expert here at all. I just want to say, look, from my layman's point of view, as I look at kind of the mainstream opinion in the field and and where the evidence points at present, it seems to favor strongly the idea that the universe began to exist. Now, let me just go even further and extend that olive branch and say, look, for those who would want to deny that, and say, look, science is always provisional. There can always be new observations that will tilt the mainstream opinion the other way. It is absolutely true that as we trace back kind of the expansion of the universe, we come to the point, basically it's known as the Planck time, which is like 10 to the negative power of 47, if I recall correctly, after which our general relativistic physics breaks down. We can't really just keep describing what happened in that super brief moment since from the beginning of the universe to that Planck time. But we can be super accurate when it comes to describing what happened, how the universe developed subsequent to the Planck time. And it's true that when we come to that level of density and that level of dealing with quantum theory at this point, and we don't have an agreed upon quantum theory that every physicist agrees that we would need to describe what happens on that subatomic level once the universe is that dense. We just don't have it. So it's all provisional. Having said that, the cosmologists still ask, regardless of the final quantum theory, should we think that the ignorance with respect to that is enough for us to be to kind of not know where to cast probability with respect to whether the universe began to exist or not? And it seems to me, from a layman's point of view, that the consensus seems to be that no, it still had a beginning, even with whatever quantum theory we will introduce later on. So that's how things seem to me. We will link in the description to the actual scientist who knows what he's talking about. And now I can, I guess, unless you have some comments here, we can move on to the evidence from thermodynamic properties of the universe.
Yeah, so I don't know, maybe we'll also discuss the science from our layman point of view in the next episode, but I see here there's some people may have troubles because some people are used to the concept of the universe being infinite, and that's what I was taught at some point in school. And then you learn about these theories about universe expanding actually, and you wonder how something that is infinite can be expanding. And I think the difference between these theories, again, from a layman point of view, can trade on the concept of what the universe consists in, and it's something that we discuss. Sometimes people say that the universe is just this infinite space, and some people include matter and time into it. So it's easy to say how matter can be expanding, but how space can be expanding. That's a weird conception, but we'll get back to that maybe in the next episode.
Absolutely, but I do want to say that the mainstream opinion, as far as I can see, seems to be that there is a boundary to space and time when you look in one direction, namely its past. There may not be any termination to the expansion process, but as you trace back the expansion, you arrive at a boundary. Now, again, maybe we can discuss next time. There's some models according to which, you know, a flip happens and the universe kind of goes and expands in another direction. So then it trades upon a very controversial theory of time as well. There, that time is not linear in the same way that, and things like that. But so there have been attempts to falsify the standard Big Bang model. And again, it still had to be modified over the years, but it still remains, seems to me, the consensus that the universe began to exist. That seems to be what the evidence points. Alex Valenkin in 2011 in Cambridge, there was a conference celebrating the 70th, I think, year of Stephen Hawking. And he presented a paper. And of course, Hawking at one point tried to also come up with a model that would avoid the absolute beginning of the universe. And Valenkin kind of goes through all of them. And he concludes provocatively that basically he says, at present, all the evidence we have points in the direction of the universe having a beginning. So it's even stronger than his earlier 2003 statement where he said, a reasonable man now has proof or enough. He wants to say, not just there is preponderance of evidence, he wants to say all the evidence that we have points, which is a strong claim indeed. And again, as a layman, I don't know how to scientifically assess that. So I have to rely on experts at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, we'll talk more about that later. So let's move on to the.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Is that a fire
That's
alarm?
interesting.
Maybe we'll have to.
It is a fire alarm.
Pause here and resume our recording.
Let's pause here.
Minutes. Okay, let's pause.
Safety first.
All right.
Let's do that. Great. So another empirical confirmation that has been put forward for the truth of premise 2, that the universe began to exist, comes from the thermodynamic properties of the universe. So according to the second law of thermodynamics, which is as firmly established as anything else in physics, the total entropy, or the amount of disorder, that for any isolated system can never decrease over time, that it always increases. So this idea that entropy always increases, right? And this means that the total amount of usable energy is constantly depleting and decreasing, right? So if you leave a system, right, if you assume that a system is isolated and you leave it to its own devices, it would spontaneously evolve towards something that physicists call thermodynamic equilibrium, which is a state of maximum entropy, right? And so one line of reasoning that some physicists have advanced is, which is relevant to whether the universe began to exist or not, is this. Given that entropy always increases, why is it that if the universe never began to exist and is infinite in the past, why is it that we do not observe it in a state of thermodynamic equilibrium? After all, the sufficient condition for arriving at that state is already there, namely an infinite amount of time for the decrease and the reaching of that condition to happen. So even if, and so at this point, like almost, it just seems like given enough time, it would have been reached by now, right? And a number of physicists sort of noted that awkwardness. And this awkwardness is resolved if the universe is finite in the past, quite straightforwardly resolved, because then even assuming some kind of finite amount of usable energy, there is an explanation why it hasn't yet achieved its thermodynamic equilibrium. Namely, there hasn't been an infinite amount of time for it to have elapsed and so to have achieved that. But even if you said, look, maybe, which itself is physically a dubious proposition, that the amount of usable energy is somehow infinite, right? Has always been infinite or something like that. Even so, it seems like the sufficient condition for reaching thermodynamic equilibrium still remains that there is sufficient amount of time available for it to have happened, right? So you could kind of correlate whatever time is needed, even if we're dealing with infinite energy, right? That an infinite time would be needed to have reached it. And given if the universe never began to exist, there would be such an infinite time. Again, the question remains, why That's not what we observe. We do not observe thermodynamic equilibrium. Now, at this point, let me just immediately say, it's no good to say, well, the entropic principle applies. Of course, you shouldn't be expecting yourself to be observing something, because to do the observation, thermodynamic equilibrium should not be present, right? Should not be actual. Because we're not, that's not kind of I think the relevant question. Physicists still are within their rights to ask, that's of course true, that you have to be alive and there has to be usable energy to do the observing. But still we can ask, why, given this second law of thermodynamics and an infinite amount of time in the past, the state of affairs is as we observe it as being, right? That still seems like a sensible question to ask, and many have asked that question. And so on that ground, on those grounds, then they sort of inferred or explained that by saying maybe the universe is finite in the past.
Yeah.
All right. So go ahead, please. Oh, yeah,
Very,
please.
very quick thing to clarify for those who are not familiar with the thermodynamics. So you mentioned the concept of the thermodynamic equilibrium, and you're saying that we haven't reached that yet. How do we know when we reach that? What's that like?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry. Maybe I should have clarified it. So physicists talk about very grim prediction for the future of the universe, which is the reaching of that equilibrium. It's when all usable energy is completely gone and life cannot happen in that state. So some talk about heat death of the universe. Some talk about whatever the actual physical eschatology people are suggesting. The scenario is always grim. Like,
right.
No usable energy means no life. At least it's grim for us. It means no life is possible, period, in that state. Of course, it's assuming that the isolated system is left to its own device. It's assuming that there is causal closure, physically, that there is a closure of the physical, right? That we are dealing with a closed system, that we are leaving it to its own devices. What is its future? And physicists are straightforwardly saying, well, given the second law, its future is grim. So observing that we're alive is sufficient to say that this is not the equilibrium, right. Just by what it would mean physically for the energy.
Right. And for that, we should be grateful to the fact that the universe began to exist at some point in the past.
Yeah. That's what we would expect to be observing. To do the observing, of course, yes, we already answered that entropic principle challenge, but yeah, that's in line with the finitude of the past. That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So, but again, let me just reiterate, of course, that we are philosophers and we're mainly concerned with the philosophy side of things. So that's where I think our focus should be. But of course we can, Anton, if you want, discuss, and I will just say straightforwardly, I have no idea, right? Or I don't know how to adjudicate this scientific point because I'm a interested layman at best. Okay, so now let's talk about the philosophical argumentation. Now, there are 3 lines that I listed here, and I highlighted causal finitism. And given the time constraints, no pun intended, given the time constraints, we will not be discussing causal finitism is true line of reasoning, but we'll save that for the next time. But what we will be discussing is the actual arguments that Dr. Craig used in his work, right? And that would be those 2. Actual infinites are impossible, right? And that actual infinites cannot be formed by successive addition. So let's move to those 2. But before we do that, like I said, I promised to give a definition that's precise for the locution X begins to exist. And I need to deliver on that promise. So this is the definition Craig uses. X begins to exist at T, if and only if X comes into being at T. And the next point, X comes into being at T, if and only if X exists at T. And the actual world includes no state of affairs in which X exists timelessly. And then B, T is the first time at which X exists, and X's existing at T is a tensed fact. So I think the key move there is at the B stage, where with C, right? X is existing at T is a tensed fact. We need to be precise what we mean. But it is here that I think it's most evident, the reliance of Craig in his case for the truth of premise 2 and the truth of premise 1 on the theory of time that we need clarity on right now. Tensed theory of time. Okay, Anton, I know this is more technical. Do I need to define anything here further before we move to the next point?
So I think it's clear from my point. I hope our viewers are also able to move along. I think we discussed what the tense fact is when we introduced the difference between the tensed and tenseless theories of time. So I think
yeah,
sufficiently clear at this point.
And
yeah.
we will discuss it in just a second a bit more. I'll bring more clarity on that. But other things, I could just move on, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's
okay.
Clear. Yeah, let's move on.
Okay, that's good. Right. So now I would like to talk about the so-called tensed and tenseless theories of time. And in particular, we need to understand what is meant by tensed facts. All right. So now, to begin with, let's just think about language. We're all familiar with the role that tense plays in our language. So, for example, we inflect verbs in sentences in English to express truth, future tense, to express the past, to express tenses that are future, past, present, right? So we're familiar with that feature of our language. And although most of our ordinary language is indeed tensed, on occasion, right, we sometimes want to express tenseless truths. But because it's pervasive, the use of grammatical tense is so pervasive, we can't avoid but use that. But we don't really try to indicate any kind of tense fact by so doing. So for example, when mathematicians say 2 + 2 = 4, grammatically, the verb equals is in the present tense. But they're not really stating a tense truth. They're stating a tenseless truth. Right? So the function of tense is to locate something in relation to the present. So that's its function, right? And we can use verbs to do that, but we could also use temporal indexical expressions like now, today, tomorrow, 2 days ago, right? All of those devices locate something in relation to the present. And there is a huge difference between an expression that is tensed and the expression that is for example, using clock times or dates, for example, right? So just think of how radically different the temporal indexical expression like today and now and tomorrow is from clock times or dates expressions. So for example, today is 9th, right, of 9th of September, 2020. 9th of September, 2020 will always refer to the same, tensely, to the same date, right, to the same moment, to the same time, regardless of whether we're talking about it in 2050 or in 1800s. Like, it doesn't matter the reference frame. The giving of a date always connects you to or refers to tenselessly existing moment, okay, namely the very day we're talking about, right? So we kind of, in other words, we could think of it like this, that events are kind of time. We could give a location for an event, events existing tenselessly in time, right? So there is such a description available to us, and for that we use dates, okay? But this is radically different from, for example, me saying, today is sunny, right? The reference of today depends on the context of utterance for what it is that I'm picking out, which day I'm actually picking out. If I say today is sunny on the 9th of September, I'm actually making a statement about what's true on the 9th of September. But I could use the same linguistic expression tomorrow, and the reference changes in virtue of the context of utterance changing, right? So we observe those features in our language. Now the question is, when we say things like this, when we say the restrictions of coronavirus is on, which means to us very tangibly, we can't travel. And that fact, right, is something that might change, we hope, in 3 years, right? That we're not going to still have these restrictions, right? So the question is, when we use tensed expressions in this way and locate something in relation to the present, do we state objective facts about the pastness, presentness, or futurity of something? That when we say, for example, that 1991 is over, we're saying something about the pastness of that moment, that time. Is there something objective to that locution? Is there something objective, or are we simply commenting on our perspectival fact that for us in 2020, 1991 is past, but for people in 1991, it's present, and so on, right? Which would be to just express tenseless relations between dates. And everybody agrees those are tenseless relations, they're unchanging. So is there a body of facts that is constantly changing? That's the issue here. And the intuition seems to me that is that it's on the side with the view that such body is changing, that there is such a body of facts. And so look at just those two examples that I listed, and then we will move on to the next slide. In 1991, Ukraine declares itself independent from Soviet Union. So a date, right, together with a grammatical tenseless expression, grammatically tensed in terms of the verb being in the present tense, but actually expressing it being a tenseless expression because its function is not to locate it to the present. In that combination is sufficient to express a tenseless truth, right? That what happens invariably in 1991, right? Regardless of which time frame we're dealing with. But notice that affirming that first point is not going to give you the information with respect to the pastness of 1991, right? Knowing that fact, that tenseless fact, is not going to give you the fact about it being over, that 1991 is the past. Whereas inflecting a verb in the second sentence, Ukraine declared itself independent from the Soviet Union, immediately suggests, right, that the moment is in the past, that the event is in the past. Now notice, if the event is in the past, then the moment time in which it exists is also in the past. So in other words, that the moments of that 1991 is past, that would be a kind of an objective fact on this view, right? But if there are tensed facts, then time itself is tensed. And so it would be the tense theory of time, right? That we need to then make sense of that, of the body of changing tensed facts. So finally, I just want to very briefly show clearly kind of state two theories of time here. Hopefully it will be helpful for people. So again, it's a rough outline. So tense theory of time says that tense is an objective feature of reality, not just of our language and experience. Whereas tenseless theory of time says that tense is merely a feature of human language and experience. Like everyone agrees that tense is probably not eliminable, that our consciousness is so structured that we can't eliminate tense. We think in a tensed way. The issue is, does that correlate to the mind-independent reality or not? Or is it just in our head, what we have to do in virtue of our limitations, say, as particular kind of creatures? So that's the relevant debate. And second point, temporal becoming is objective. Things really do come into being and go out of being, or come into existence and go out and cease to exist. Whereas on the tense theory of time, temporal becoming is an illusion of human consciousness. It's a perspectival fact. On the tense theory of time, not all moments of time are equally real or existent. On the tenseless theory, all moments of time are equally real or existent. On the tense theory of time, the universe is a three-dimensional object enduring through time. On the tenseless theory of time, the universe is a four-dimensional space-time block, timelessly existing as a whole, right? And finally, and this is where the implication for the Kalam comes in, the universe began to exist equals the universe came into being on the tense theory of time. But the universe began to exist on the tenseless theory of time is equivalent to the universe has a front edge, right? And of course, if that's what we mean, then the intuition about out of nothing, nothing comes, these arguments become problematic, as you could see intuitively, immediately, right? To say that the stick or this pen has a front edge, that may not be sufficient to then sort of appeal to metaphysical principle of coming into being, which is a absolute effect of absolute becoming. Something really comes into existence. No, on the tense theory of time, that is not true of the world objectively speaking. That's only true of how we perceive reality. So there's a mouthful here, Anton, I fully admit. So please tell me if I need to expand on anything, but it's kind of a brief statement, but we will have to ask in the next episode, which theory of time is true as philosophers.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I want to say immediately the one weakness of Craig's version of the Kalam is because it's wedded to the tense theory of time. It can be claimed that it's at odds with our best science when it comes to the relativity theory. So many, probably the majority, are actually not tensors when it comes to theories of time. They embrace tenseless theory of time, following Einstein and Minkowski's interpretation of relativity. So, but now I think that tense theory of time is true. I'm comfortable in this position, but I totally see why it's a weakness strategically. That the argument I think is sound requires that people embrace something that many physicists think, in fact, is not the right view of time. Like that matters to me, and I have to have a good reason for thinking that, as I do, that tense theory of time is true. So anyway, I just want to be very vulnerable here and say that is, in my view, the biggest problem for the Kalam. Now, having said that, the causal finitism line is still going to be available. So you can rephrase it. The Kalam can be rephrased in such a way that you still have to have a first cause, even though tenseless theory of time is true. But that we will discuss as a kind of fallback option in the next episode, what a theist can appeal to at this point. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Any thoughts, Anton, or should we move on?
No, I think let's move on, and we'll talk more about the theories of times next time.
Perfect.
And see why someone who is committed to a tense theory of time, as you do, which is common sense view, should perhaps doubt their position.
Reject.
We'll get
exactly.
to that.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Right. So let's then move to the philosophical argument number one for premise two. And this argument is, we can call it from the impossibility of an actual infinite. So I will read the argument, and then we need to define the terms and get some distinctions clear in our heads. The first premise reads, an actual infinite cannot exist. The second premise says, an infinite temporal regress of events is an actual infinite. Therefore, an infinite temporal regress of events cannot exist. So we will now define in just a second what is meant by actual infinity, what is meant by cannot here, which sense of modality we're using here, and what we mean by exist. But I want now just to look at premise 2 and 3 and recognize the relevance of this argument for the beginning of the universe. Right? If the universe is infinite in the past, actually infinite in the past, let's just use this pre-theoretical notion of actual infinity, actually never began to exist, infinite in the past, then we are dealing with an infinite temporal regress of events in the history of the universe, right? So it would be an instance of an actual infinite. But if it's also true that no actual infinite can exist, which is what premise 1 states, you could therefore conclude that an infinite temporal regress of events cannot exist, right? And so deny that the universe is infinite in the past or never began to exist. I want to ask if just a structure is clear enough that there is no issue with validity, and all we need to actually look at is the premise 1, which makes the substantive claim an actual infinite cannot exist.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Good. Awesome. So let's move to that. Okay, so the first big distinction we need to make is between actual versus potential infinite. So without spending like a history lesson here, I really have to be brief now. think of potential infinity as take any finite distance. You could divide it in half, but then you can divide that half into half, right? And you could divide it in halves, fourths, eighths, sixteenths, and so on, right? Endlessly. So the conception of a potential infinite is basically, this is where infinity is like an ideal limit that is approached endlessly by some process, right? But is never actually reached. You will never actually reach an infinitieth division. There's always going to be yet another division that, at least, if not physically, we're not talking physically here, at least mathematically can be done. You can keep on dividing and halving the smaller and smaller distances. So that's the potential infinite idea. And this was the kind of the normal view of infinity. Now, mathematically, as far as notation, we use kind of the lazy 8 to represent that kind of where infinity is just a limit that is never actually reached, but it's approached endlessly. Right? And the Kalam cosmological argument is absolutely on board with the existence of potential infinites. All it means is that there are endless processes that will never come to an end. No actual infinities yet, it's just potentially infinite. There is a particular progression that is unending, right? Now let's talk about the concept of an actual infinite. And again, not to bore our audience, but we do need to talk about modern set theory, because this is where this conception is very well defined and used. So first we need to talk about sets a bit. So what is a set? A set, and again, actually sets are hard to define precisely. So the set theory we need to use is actually axiomatic set theory, not naive set theory, which attempts to define precisely what set is. But rather, in axiomatic set theory, sets are just roughly just collections of things. And for example, you can collect 0, 1, 2, 3 into a set, right? In your thought, you can just say, well, I'm talking about those very 4 members of a set and members of a collection. That's what I'm collecting in thought. And notice that it's finite. There isn't a finite number of members of that set. Okay. Now, an example of an infinite set in set theory would be the set of all natural numbers, right? So here it would be numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on ad infinitum, right? And we could also ask about all the set of all natural numbers, how many of them there are. And Georg Cantor was first to kind of advance a straightforward answer. Well, it is an actual infinite number of numbers that we're dealing with, an actual infinite number of members in a set of all natural numbers. But now it's important that here the number of members is really a number. So the lazy 8 was not a number, actually. It's a limit concept. Whereas here, when set theorists talk about actual infinites, it is a number. Granted, it's not a finite number, it's transfinite, but it's a number nevertheless. And it stands for the number of members in a collection, in a set. Here is the next point. How would you compare sizes of sets? Well, one way to compare it is to line them up side by side, like have a 1-to-1 correspondence between each member in a set and another set, right? So, for example, how would you compare the sizes of the set of 4 numbers, the ones that people are seeing now, 0, 1, 2, and 3, and the set of numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5? The way you do it, you would place one next to the other, and then you say, well, 0 is equivalent to 0 in the other, 1 to 1, 2 to 2, 3 to 3, and then one set will begin containing members that do not have 1-to-1 correspondence with your original set, and that entitles you to conclude the second set is larger. It has more members. Okay. An infinite set, and this is where things become counterintuitive, an infinite set is defined as having a proper subset that has the same amount of members, the same number of members, namely infinite number, as the original set. So for example, take the set of all natural numbers and then compare that to the set of all even numbers, right? If you line them up, there will always be a one-to-one correspondence between each member in both sets. And that is what this is how Cantor defined an infinite set, is that its proper subset is the same size as the set as a whole. Okay. And I know it's counterintuitive, but as far as a mathematical conception, it's quite rigorous. And in the axiomatic set theory, it just follows from the axioms. Okay.
So sorry, Dima.
Anton, do you have any? Yeah, please go ahead.
Get confused. So there are two sets. One contains all the natural numbers and it's infinite, and the other set contains all even numbers.
All the even numbers, and it's also infinite.
And it's also infinite.
Size.
And
it's also infinite.
And so when we compare these two sets, what happens?
When we compare these two sets, we have one-to-one correspondence between each member of each set. Of each set. For example, 0 would be correlated to 2, 1 would be correlated to 4, 3 would be correlated to 8, and so on, right? So or to 6, and so on. So you just have a correlation between all numbers and even numbers, right? And the idea here is that that's how you compare sets, number one. And number two, that's what we understand an infinite set to be about, that it has proper subsets that are equal in size, in the sense that they have the same number of members. There may be other senses of larger, smaller, that you can, again, using axioms, define, but not in terms of how many members, but more like, well, one contains members that the other set does not contain. But still, if you line them up in one-to-one correspondence, the consistency would still be there with respect to every single number in the original set and this other set we're comparing it to, which is its proper subset.
And so the problem is that we intuitively want to say that one set contains the other, but then we have no way of saying it because both sets are infinite in their own right.
Well, so we have a way of saying that, Anton. We have, and this way would, and the way to say that one set contains the other is to say that every member in one set is found as a member in another set. So we could find in the set of all natural numbers all of the even numbers, all right? It's just that we also find there all of the odd numbers that are not found in the set of all even numbers, right? So we can say which one is proper subset of a set. That we can do. What we cannot say is that the proper subset we cannot say that one is larger in the sense of has more numbers or has more members.
And that's weird, right? So
say again?
And that's weird, and that leads us to the idea that the actual infinite sets should not exist.
Well, this is where we got to trade very carefully. Because what I want to say at this point is that this is where we need to distinguish between, you could say, two senses of exist. So according to one sense of exist, something exists in a mind-independent sense, in the real world, right? It obtains, it's instantiated extra-theoretically, extra-mentally, right? But there is another sense of exist. You could say in the universe of mathematics, a concept of an actual infinite is mathematically legitimate concept. Like, think of it like in the history of mathematics, many concepts were judged at some point as problematic. And they had to fight for their legitimacy, like the concept of zero or the imaginary number or other complex numbers. Like you had to, in a way, justify rigorously, yes, based on axioms, the legitimacy of some idea and concept in math. But that is a different question from saying there is or even can be an extra theoretical correlate in the mind-independent world of such an idea. So this is where the argument is. It's not at any point doubting the legitimacy of Cantor or modern set theory. It's legitimate. You could coherently speak about and talk about actual infinites. But the attempt will be made here to say that if such a thing existed in a real world, certain metaphysical, not logical, strictly logical, but metaphysical absurdities would result if it were to exist in a real world and not just in the universe of discourse that mathematicians play with. So that's the real question, not the legitimacy of it. It's super legit. The question is possibility of mind-independent metaphysical instantiation of such ideas. That's where even mathematicians, like we will talk about, doubt, like David Hilbert did, that it can. So yeah, so now I already, by responding to you, Anton, I already basically explained the distinction between mathematical legitimacy and existence in a mind-independent way. So now it remains for me just to clarify the sense of cannot. And the sense of cannot here is metaphysically speaking cannot. And honestly, this is a bit of a woolly notion, isn't it? Like, we know what it means to say something is strictly logically impossible. There is some kind of contradiction formally that you could show between certain statements. We can also understand what it means to say physically impossible. We could say, well, there are descriptions of the way the world works, according to which such an occurrence is ruled out. But the in-between modality, the in-between metaphysical cannot, is granted, it's a bit more open to speculation, more subjective at this point. So let me just say the sense in which it's used here. So for example, there is nothing strictly logically impossible in the idea that a prime minister is a prime number. Like, there's no known law of logic that is violated by that statement alone. However, we think that that's impossible metaphysically, right? Not just physically. Like, it can't be that a prime minister is a prime number. Like, there's something about what it means to be a human being that is incompatible with being an abstract object. So that's a notion of metaphysical possibility, right? That is different from both physical and strictly logical possibility. And that's what I think many of the arguments trade on, is precisely this metaphysical possibility. And not so strictly logically, because if you can show that there is mathematical legitimacy to an idea, you have shown that it's strictly logically possible. The issue is it metaphysically possible? Any comments on this, Anton? But before I continue.
No, I think that's useful. So so we'll be speaking here about the metaphysical impossibility, which is somewhat intuitive and lies somewhere in between.
It's debatable. Like, this is where intuitions might vary, and
Right.
And you might have commitments that lead you to affirm that something is possible, and another person lacks those commitments. So we can talk about that when we
Right. So it's important for our purposes just to make a distinction between metaphysical and the logical possibility, because something can be logically possible.
Strictly logical. Because metaphysical possibility is sometimes called broad logical possibility.
Right.
But we are dealing with strict logical possibility on one hand. Yeah, broad logical.
So talking about infinity, infinite sets can be strictly logically possible.
Absolutely.
But metaphysically impossible.
There might be certain problems to instantiate an idea like that in the real world. Yeah, exactly right. But the idea already will not be in the form, the problem with that thought would not be in the form of a logical contradiction here. It would be in the form of some kind of absurdity. Again, an appeal to intuition will be made. Some kind of metaphysical absurdity that one detects and thinks, well, I can't, that is problematic, right? But it's going to be less rigorous than, well, here's a contradiction. Deal with that. That is not something that this argument can deliver. So now, as we move to that, we can kind of remember that as we think about it. So what I want to do now is basically briefly state, give an illustration which is famous, Hilbert's hotel illustration that originally comes back to German mathematician David Hilbert, who loved the idea of infinity, actual infinity. And he said, like, at one point, he said, like, nobody now, ever since Georg Cantor, brought to our attention as mathematicians this idea of an actual infinite, will take us out of our paradise in mathematics, right? Take us out of this awesome universe of infinite sets and so on. It's going to be here to stay. But he himself doubted definitely the reality of its extra theoretical instantiation, but also on some accounts, it's very possibility, metaphysically speaking, right? So, and he gave this illustration. And again, so as I will be doing it, so here's my statement. As I will be doing it, what is not contested is that David Hilbert understood the concept of an actual infinite. And moreover, what's not contested is that he correctly described in a thought experiment of an infinite hotel what would follow were this idea to be instantiated with respect to an infinite hotel. That's not in doubt. But we will come to see the problems for this illustration later. But I do want to make, like, kind of prevent people from thinking, oh, it's because we don't understand the concept of infinity. No, it's very well defined. And it's precisely because we do understand it that we could do this illustration accurately, that it has some value. All right, so let's talk about it. So let's start with, first of all, a finite hotel. And there is a proprietor, and the person wants to check into that finite hotel. And by finite hotel, I mean a hotel that has a finite number of rooms. And again, in this thought experiment, let's just stipulate that all the rooms are filled. And there's always at most one person per room, right? So those are the stipulation of the thought experiment. So the next person, so a new visitor comes in and he wants to check in the finite hotel, and all the rooms are full. And so the proprietor turns him down. The manager says, sorry, no room. But what would happen if a person arrives at a hotel that has an actual infinite number of rooms? And by the way, just to be very clear, by an actual infinite number, I do not mean a kind of imperfect infinity, which is just a potentiality. Like, let's say the hotel keeps expanding and the new and new rooms keep being added. No, no, no. The collection is complete. The set is complete. And it has distinct members in it. And the actual number of those rooms is a transfinite number, aleph nil, right? An actual infinite number. So with that in mind, the person comes in and he wants to check in, and the proprietor goes, oh, no problem. Let me just move the person in room number 1 to room number 2, the person in room number 2 to room number 3. So in every person, always to a room greater than by 1, right? The number of to the room that has a number greater by 1, right? And so through doing this operation, he has just freed room number 1, and the glad guest can check in. Okay. Now, but here's what's weird. Again, weird, seems absurd, because you have to say mathematically, there is now not more people in the hotel. It's the same amount of people. The number of members, the number of people staying in the hotel has not changed after this. But hey, we've just seen the person come in. We've just handed him keys. He's now in room number 1, right? We've just given him towels and so on. So you can kind of begin making it seem counterintuitive, right? To still say, no, the number is the same. But it gets a bit worse, right? You could imagine an infinite number of guests wanting to check in. And you can always accommodate them through an operation like this. You put the person in room number 1 to room number 2, the person in room number 2 to room number 4, 3 to 6, and so on, immediately basically leaving odd-numbered rooms available for an infinity of new guests to check in. And still, once they check in, mathematically, it would be correct to say that the number of people staying in the hotel has not changed, even though we have just observed an infinity of new guests checking in. So that seems absurd. That seems problematic. But then you can kind of keep going. You could say, well, all right, but what if you have, by the way, you could repeat this infinitely many times. You can bring new infinities infinitely many times, right? And the hotel that was full to begin with is immediately accommodating for new infinities of people without adding any new room in the hotel. The number of rooms stays the same. So it's not an imperfect infinite that's growing. It's the complete set of distinct members. But David Hilbert did not continue this, but Craig sort of continues, and he kind of says, well, what happens if somebody checks out of the hotel? Like, when we're dealing with a metaphysical instantiation, a mind-independent reality, there's nothing that would prevent people from dying or checking out or things like that, right? But according to the axiomatic set theory, certain operations are prohibited. Subtraction from an infinite is prohibited. Division is prohibited. And that's just a stipulation. It's just an axiom. You would slap a hand of the mathematician who would want to do a procedure like that on an actual infinite. But what would stop people from checking out? And if they do, so see, one reason why in set theory you cannot subtract from infinity is because it leads to contradictory results. Because subtracting from an infinite, you could subtract the same amount of equal number of things from an equal number of things and get results from infinity to 0 to any finite number whatsoever. So here's an illustration. Suppose you want to take away an infinity of guests from a hotel and arrive at 4 as your result. No problem. Just ask all of the guests staying in rooms number 5 and on to check out. And in a second, all you have are four guests staying in an infinite hotel, right? Through that operation. But you could also take away an infinite number, the same number of guests, and arrive at infinity. You get rid of even numbered rooms, guests in even numbered rooms, and you get still an infinite number of guests in odd numbered rooms. Or you could just completely take all of the people from the hotel and have 0. So these leads to problems. And so you have these constraints in set theory, axiomatically, of what is meaningful to do as far as operations. But if we're dealing with extramental instantiation, who would be slapping whose hand? Who would be stopping people from checking out? So that's where Craig tries to motivate the absurdity of the scenario. And the main culprit seems to be not the mathematics. The main culprit seems to be the move to extramental possibility of its instantiation. And so that's essentially the argument. The argument is that metaphysical absurdities would result if one is denied, namely that it's denied that actual infinites cannot exist. So before I say before I just give a flag the objection to this, any thoughts, Anton, on this, if you want to add or clarify anything?
Yeah, I'm vaguely familiar with this example. I think I came across the hotel example at some point before, but so my immediate worry for that would be, are we talking of a hotel that just has the infinite number of rooms, or are we talking of a hotel that also has the infinite number of guests in it, filling each and every room?
That's great, yes.
Because if the number of guests is finite is one situation, and we can see how it could work. But if the number of guests is infinite, then supposedly the objection could be that you can just not add guests to it, because the set that contains the infinite number of guests already contains that guest that you want to add. So it can be nothing more than the infinity.
Well, yeah. So let me respond to this worry. So the thought experiment by David Hilbert stipulated that when the new guest arrives into the infinite hotel asking for a room, you also have all of the guests occupying all of the rooms in the hotel. That's the start of the experiment.
Right.
And if you think about that, there doesn't seem to be anything in any segment there of that infinite hotel that is impossible. Like if there can be an actual infinite number of rooms, then presumably there can be an infinite number of people staying in those rooms. But you're asking, but from where would these other people come? Well, think of it. Suppose you do have infinite number of people staying in a hotel, but people continue to procreate, or we could just invent, this is a thought experiment, we could just invent a creation of a new individual wanting to check in. That doesn't seem to me to be a problem, right? So the thought experiment is, I think, quite tight as far as the possibility of new guests coming in. When we're talking about actual infinite number of anything, there are gradations of infinities. Like, what about the irrational numbers? Right? This is another magnitude, right? That could be used. Even if there is a set of all natural numbers, that does not mean that this completely exhausts the set of all numbers, period, because you have rational and irrational numbers and so on. And you actually, in set theory, you have Aleph nil. Is just the beginning of infinities of transfinite numbers.
Yeah. Well, I guess my problem is that if we have an infinite set of guests, does that mean that that set would include a guest that would
all the people
that would be identical to every other possible human being. Because if
Great.
not, can we really call this an infinite set? So
Yeah.
that's kind of the worry.
Yeah, and so this is where, from the set theoretic point of view, there's no problem, precisely because the way you prove that it has an infinite number is by lining it up to, I don't know, the set of all natural numbers. That's enough. If you say, just like with even numbers, you could do that and still say there are odd numbers that exist in a larger set, in some sense of larger, right? According to some definition of larger, that doesn't just compare amount of members or the number of members in the set. So that worry, I don't like. Yeah, but I see the intuition. The question is, can you advance the thought experiment? No, if you say that the number of guests staying in the hotel isn't just an infinite number corresponding to the number of rooms to begin the thought experiment with, but it's the same also number as the number of potential human beings, but that's a different set. Number of potential human beings might be larger than the set of people staying in a hotel, which is an actual infinite number.
Right.
Yeah. So, but I want to raise this worry, and this worry comes from Graham Malpe and a number of other guys that want to say, look, the two things. One, the more you dwell with, the more you study set theory, the less crazy these scenarios will seem to you, because you're kind of expecting, that's what we would expect actual infinities to be like, were they instantiated. So what's the problem, Craig, exactly, right? That's what we would expect if there were an actual infinite number. Yeah, it's counterintuitive, so what? Set theory is counterintuitive, so what? So that's one reply that we might need to discuss. But another reply is something like this. Granted, this is absurd, and maybe there is some theoretical cost in one's system to accept an absurdity like that. But what makes it absurd is something peculiar to this thought experiment. What makes it absurd is the possibility of performing certain operations. When you think, though, about an infinite past of the universe, the possibility of moving events around is metaphysically not there. So what creates the absurdity is that the manager can move people around. But if there is no such movement possible, if no such operations are possible with respect to some actual infinite sets, then there is a problem of generalizing from Hilbert Hotel to all sets. So what Craig will want to say here is basically that, well, you can still assign, even to an actual infinite temporal regress of events, you could still assign a number and mentally do moving around. But I think this is a weaker point on Craig's part. Now we're dealing with mental operation, but we thought we were going to talk about metaphysical operation that's instantiatable. In other words, the generalization issue still remains, I think, although maybe, in my view, Hilbert's Hotel does illustrate that at least some infinities seem absurd and are absurd, and maybe there is some cost in accepting them, but it still needs to be shown that they are therefore relevant when it comes to an actual infinite number of events in the history of the world. We can talk about that later, like in our next episode. Yeah?
Yeah, let's move on because we're running out of time.
Yeah, okay, yes. Gotcha. So the next one, and this is going to be super brief, this is from the impossibility of forming an actual infinite by successive addition, one member after another. So here, it says a collection formed by successive addition cannot be actually infinite. 5, the temporal series of events is a collection formed by successive addition, right? And again, assuming the tense theory of time, this works, because you have a coming into being of new and new events in the history of the world. This would be a collection formed by successive addition. Therefore, the temporal series of events cannot be an actual infinite. Notice two things. Even if it turned out that an actual infinite can exist extramentally, what cannot happen, this argument claims, is that it be formed by successive addition of one member after another, right? So suppose, Platonism is true, and there are an infinite number of numbers, an infinite number of propositions that exist as abstract objects, then there is a counterexample to the claim that there can not possibly be actual infinite multitudes. But still, it is a separate question to ask. Well, if the temporal series of events is a collection formed by successive addition, could such a formation be done? And could you arrive ever at infinity? So we talked about the impossibility of counting to infinity. You can always add one more member, finite number to your count. You will never reach infinity because in a way, an infinite, the transfinite number, that would be the number of members in a set of all natural numbers, right, is kind of beyond the set. It's not part of the set. It's not another finite number. It's transfinite number. So you will never reach that transfinite number by just adding one number after the other. There's going to be always yet another finite number to be added. And so the argument goes, a collection cannot be therefore formed. And if it were able to be formed, then the following scenario would have to be possible, but there are problems with it. So suppose you find a man who claims to have been counting from eternity past and is now finishing his count. So he was counting all the negative numbers and is now arriving at 0 right now as you speak to him. So he says -3, -2, -1, 0. And supposedly that marks the formation of an actual infinite right there and then. The problem with that is that you can ask, well, why did you stop your count now, right? After all, at any finite time distant from the present, you would have already had the sufficient conditions for forming an actual infinite, namely an infinite amount of time in the past, right? So this seems problematic that, in other words, at no time in the past should we be expecting to see man finishing his count, because at every time in the past, he should have been finished by then. But hey, here he is standing in front of us. This is our thought experiment. He's finishing his count now. So that seems like almost like as close to a contradiction as Craig's type of arguments give you, is that there is a thought experiment that has a man finish his count now, but he couldn't, but it's inexplicable why he would be finishing his count now. Therefore, there is some kind of problem with the idea that he's been counting from eternity past. So that's, again, for the sake of time, we might just need to move on, but that's another angle. Even if you grant actual infinites are possible, the formation of it might matter, how exactly it was formed. And in the case of infinite past of the universe, it would be events that are being formed one by one. And that might be problematic on the tense theory of time. Any comments before I continue and finish it up?
No, let's move on.
Okay, sounds good. So final, I'm not going to spend time on this, but let me just say two things. The argument from causal finitism is something we will discuss next time. I do think this is probably the strongest argument for the truth of premise 2. And the reason is twofold. One, it is actually an argument that can reveal a contradiction. Okay, so, and that's a big deal, where the nature of this paradox is that you have contradiction on your hands and you have to deny one of the seemingly plausible statements. And the claim would be that the best thing to deny would be that the universe is infinite in the past, or that infinity that the series of the causal chains can be actually infinite is what you have to deny on the basis of this argument. And notice it's causal finitism. Not every series is problematic, just causal series are problematic. So that's the claim. And finally, it does not at all assume Craig's favorite theory of time. Craig can still use this argument because it works equally well on A and B theory or tenseless theory. But because it's independent, I think it gives a theist even more maneuver at this point to justify premise 2. Because the other arguments we've looked at do seem to assume the A theory of time or the tense theory of time. All right, so that's that. And finally, we do have to discuss, or else it's not going to be proper ending, we have stage 2 of the argument. And stage 2, okay, so suppose you are convinced that premise 1 and 2 are true, and you have more reasons to accept them than you do to believe in their negation. And you arrive at the conclusion that the universe was caused to exist by something else. Now we can inquire, what are the properties that we can infer about this something else in question? And so let's look at Craig's list of qualities that he wants to say you could reasonably infer, if not deduce. And I think a number of them definitely is not deducible, but at least it's something like an inference to the best explanation. So let's look at the list timeless, because it created time, or at least where time is metric. So something we haven't discussed, Anton, is another debate, which is between guys that see time, okay, the substantivalist view of time, according to which time is ontologically prior to events, and a relational view of time, according to which events are ontologically prior to time. In other words, on the relational view, which is my view, which is the view, I guess, most people today, on the relational view, time exists because events exist. Time exists because change happens, right? And the idea of empty time, as Newton speculated about, on this view would be rejected in favor of relational view. So the big titans, right? Newton, Isaac Newton defending substantivalist view of time, and Leibniz defending the relational view of time. These are relevant historical figures, right, that defended these. But if you go with substantivalist view of time, then you can believe that the cause or the something else exists in some kind of metaphysical time prior to the metric physical time, which is what physicists talk about when they talk about the beginning of time with respect to the universe. That physical time, time measured by clocks, by events that occur and observable, by changes that we observe. When you think about the clock, it's just a measuring mechanism. It's the change of the mechanism that allows you to differentiate between moments. But in the absence of any change whatsoever, would time exist? So if you believe in substantivalist view of time, then you could still say, yeah, metaphysical time exists. It's changelessness in that it's changeless, which is why it's not metric. You can't measure it. There's no sense in saying 70 seconds ago something happened. Nothing happened 70 seconds. There is no differentiation between seconds and years. But here the point is that metric time began to exist, and then the something else must exist in non-metric time. So if you have a relational view of time, that just means for you exists timelessly. Or else, yet finally, you could still talk about metaphysical time, even though you think it's relational view that's right, with respect to God, but then you still will have the same argument, same reason would apply to, let's say, even if time is not measured by physical changes, suppose there is a thought process that's happening in God's mind, and one thought goes after another. Then there is already time in virtue of not physical changes, but what? Mental changes, mental events occur. And so time would have to exist on the relational view of time. So that's still a possibility, but then the argument would still be pressed against that view to lead you to, at some point, a terminus. At some point, there has to be changelessness. At some point, the regress has to stop if actual infinite regress cannot be formed or is impossible. So basically, to not overcomplicate it, timeless because in the physical sense of time, timeless. Beyond time in that sense, because it brought and created time, and we already took on board the idea of causation, according to which cause and effect are separate existences. All right, so the next point is changeless, because timeless, again in the metric sense. If there is change, there is time in the metric sense. You can measure it. Spaceless, because it brought all space into existence. Right? It's the cause, it's separate from the effect, but the effect just is coming into being of space itself, so it has to be spaceless. This is where we might discuss further, like immaterial, because it brought all matter into existence. That's what we meant by the universe coming into being. That's the claim anyway, that all matter, all physical reality came to be. So the something else would have to be non-physical, right? It's immensely powerful because it created the entire universe without a material cause. And finally, it's personal. And for that, we need additional argumentation. So the first one is basically that the only two explanations for any phenomena that we are aware of are personal and scientific explanations. So you can ask, well, why is the kettle boiling? Two explanations we are familiar with. The first one is scientific, because of how molecules move with respect to the liquid. that the heat is therefore due to the movement of certain molecules. So you can explain by invoking temperature, movement of molecules, you could explain the fact that the kettle is boiling. And that would be to posit a scientific explanation, to refer to certain laws. And in terms of those laws, you account for why something is the case. But then we're also familiar with personal explanation. You say, well, why is the kettle boiling? Because I wanted to make tea and offer it to you. That's another kind of explanation that I don't think is incompatible necessarily with scientific, but we also observe the difference. Because in one, intentions of agents never play a role. By definition of what it means to offer a scientific explanation, agential intentions just aren't there, because it's then to invoke telos, goal-directedness, and things like that. But scientists are actually dealing with just efficient causation, material causation. They don't deal with final causes. They don't deal with intentions. But at least we're familiar with personal explanation. When a theist says that the cause of the universe is personal, the theist is offering a personal explanation, not a scientific explanation. So, in other words, if there are only two viable options, scientific and personal, and it's not scientific, we kind of infer it's probably personal. And it's still a familiar category to us. Why it can't be scientific? Because the very universe with laws that describe it began to exist. So it can in principle be scientific. We're dealing with philosophy, metaphysics here. So it would be wrong-headed to fault a theist for not offering a scientific explanation of the very laws in their existence that describe the universe, right, that begins to exist. So the second point is inference to the best explanation given to the live options which match the properties of timelessness, immateriality, spacelessness, causal power. So here it's assumed that these other items are had, and then it's asked, what do we know of that could in principle fit that kind of category? And you could, what do we know of, or at least speculate about, that could fit that? So a philosopher could say, well, Platonic abstract objects might, like number 7 is spaceless, immaterial, timeless, right? But the very definition of abstracta is that they're causally a fit, like they lack causal powers. Number 7 can cause anything, doesn't stand in any causal relations to anything. So then the only other category that people have been speculating about over the years have been an immaterial mind that brings forth an effect. So you can see immediately how at this point, if you have a knockdown argument against the possibility of immaterial mind's existence, right? If you have strong arguments that minds have to be embodied, that the brain has to exist in some way, then that could be a direct kind of resistance to this as an inference to the best explanation. But at least from as far as like, if we're charitable about live options to begin with, and we're not begging the question against the theist that God is impossible, period, because it's an immaterial mind of some sort, then I think it's at least worth asking, how would that explanation work if offered? And then finally, the last point is that if the cause is some impersonal set of necessary and sufficient conditions for the universe's beginning to exist, then it's inexplicable why and how an eternal cause can exist without a co-eternal effect. So just imagine for a second if from eternity past, it has always been the case that the temperature is minus 100 Celsius. How could it be that only a finite time ago the effect of water freezing happened? How can it be that that the frozen water state, that the ice state, right, the solid state wouldn't be a co-eternal effect in virtue of it being constantly dependent on the sufficient conditions for its existence on the cause, which is the temperature being a particular way. So it seems like only if the cause is impersonal, plausibly, you get a situation where, let's say, by the use of one's libertarian free will, and again, this is a rabbit hole, we need to talk about libertarian free will conception versus others. Is that even possible? But supposing it's possible, a free action of an agent might account for a change. So for example, Craig gives an illustration of somebody sitting from eternity on the chair and then standing up. A real change occurs, which just is the beginning of time in virtue of it being the first change. And so you have this new effect in virtue of the freely willed decision to get up. And the intention to get up would timelessly be there, right? And then there is this free act that constitutes the first change, at least in God, and therefore in the effect of what happens. So that's basically the three arguments in favor, but you could see how somebody might resist the other ones that I listed. Immaterial, what about disembodied minds? Like, you know, our best theory of mind might tell us otherwise, that substance dualism is false or some such. And of course, personal is another huge thing that I think that the best way to think of this last bit is that it is an indication that it might be personal. It's an indication. I'm not claiming that it proves or you can deduce that, not at all. Just an indication, but I think it's an important one. All right, so let me just conclude. To wrap up, these are the sources that I used, and those want to see, and not all, like I have to use for this presentation. And I look forward to our objections time next time, Tom.
Great. Yeah, just to remind to our audience that this episode was basically a statement of the argument. So next time we'll discuss some of the possible objections against it, and see what conclusion we want to come to. So we'll look forward to seeing you next time. In the meantime, if you have any clarifying questions or comments about the argument as it has been stated today, please feel free to send us your comments or questions, and we'll make sure to address them at some point. And stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you very much, Dima, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time to discuss this further.
Me too. I cannot wait.
All right. See you. Bye.
Bye.